Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into the shadowy corners of English folklore, where innocent wishes transformed into generational nightmares, exploring the curious case of England's cursed wells, where desperate prayers twisted into something far more sinister than anyone intended. You're settling into your favorite spot, probably thinking this will be another cozy tale about quaint British superstitions, but you probably won't survive this journey without questioning every fountain you've ever tossed a coin into. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. So drop a comment and let me know if you're joining me from your bedroom in Boston at midnight or your kitchen in Kiev at dawn. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing beside an ancient stone well somewhere in the English countryside, its weathered rim worn smooth by countless desperate hands, while the sound of dripping water echoes from depths that seem to stretch beyond the physical realm into something altogether more troubling. The morning mist clings to the surrounding moorland like the remnants of forgotten prayers, and you can almost hear the whispered pleas that have been offered to these dark waters for over 2,000 years, each wish carrying its own peculiar burden of unintended consequences. You're not just observing a relic of rural England. You're witnessing the birthplace of a phenomenon that transformed simple human desires into elaborate supernatural contracts, where the universe seemed to delight in interpreting every request with the literal mindedness of a particularly vindictive genie. The Romans, those efficient empire builders who gave us straight roads and indoor plumbing, also documented the first instances of what they called aqua maleficae, cursed waters, that granted wishes in ways that made the petitioners immediately regret their specificity, though historians still debate whether Roman accounts should be considered reliable historical sources or early examples of imperial propaganda designed to discredit local Celtic religious practices. These weren't your typical fairy tale wishing wells where coins disappeared into clear blue depths with a satisfying plop and a cheerful sparkle. These were ancient springs that bubbled up from underground rivers, flowing through limestone caves that had witnessed everything from mammoth migrations to medieval massacres, carrying with them the accumulated spiritual residue of millennia. You breathe in the damp air and taste something metallic, though whether it's iron from the water or something less pleasant from the soil, you're not entirely sure you want to know. The Celtic tribes who first settled these lands understood that certain places held power, but they also understood that power without proper respect and ritual could turn malevolent faster than milk left in the summer sun, which is why they developed elaborate ceremonies involving specific offerings, precise timing, and protective incantations that modern visitors tend to skip in favor of the more convenient throw money and hope for the best approach. What makes these particular wells different from their more benevolent cousins scattered across Europe is their apparent ability to interpret wishes with the creative malice of a legal contract written by someone who actively dislikes you, turning "I wish for wealth" into "your family will inherit a fortune, but only after a series of increasingly tragic accidents," or transforming "I wish to be reunited with my beloved" into scenarios that make Stephen King novels seem optimistic by comparison. You notice how the vegetation around the well seems slightly off. The grass grows too green, the flowers bloom out of season, and the trees lean away as if trying to escape some invisible influence, which local botanists have documented but struggle to explain through conventional scientific methods, leading to ongoing scholarly debate regarding whether environmental anomalies around ancient sites reflect geological factors, electromagnetic phenomena, or something that makes both geologists and electromagnetic specialists distinctly uncomfortable. The first recorded instance of a wish going spectacularly wrong at one of these sites dates back to 78 AD, when a Roman centurion named Marcus Aurelius Corvus, no relation to the emperor, despite what tour guides might tell you, wished for victory in battle, and subsequently won every engagement for the remainder of his career, which sounds wonderful until you realize that his definition of victory and the universe's definition of victory turned out to be dramatically different, resulting in technically successful military campaigns that left him as the sole survivor of each encounter, which definitely wasn't what he had in mind when he dropped his silver denarius into the dark water. Medieval chroniclers, those meticulous record keepers who gave us detailed accounts of everything from royal wedding menus to the precise number of angels that could theoretically dance on the head of a pin, documented dozens of cases where wishes granted at these wells created problems that persisted for generations, often requiring intervention from the church, though ecclesiastical authorities remained surprisingly divided on whether these phenomena represented demonic influence, divine punishment for excessive specificity in prayer, or merely the natural consequences of making demands of forces that humans were never meant to negotiate with directly. You can almost picture the medieval pilgrims approaching these sites with their carefully prepared requests, probably carrying handwritten notes to ensure they didn't accidentally wish themselves into some theological paradox, only to discover that ancient water spirits apparently attended the same law school as modern insurance companies when it comes to finding creative loopholes in supposedly straightforward agreements. The wells themselves vary in appearance from simple stone-lined circles to elaborate medieval structures complete with carved angels and protective symbols. But they all share certain characteristics that become apparent once you know what to look for. The water never quite reflects your face correctly. The temperature remains a constant regardless of season, and coins thrown into the depths never seem to hit bottom, leading to the somewhat disturbing realization that you're essentially posting wishes into a supernatural void with no return address and no customer service department. Local folklore suggests that the well's malevolent tendencies intensified during periods of historical stress, as if they fed on collective desperation, and grew stronger with each desperate prayer, which explains why the most dramatic incidents occurred during plague years, wartime, and economic collapse, when people were willing to accept increasingly unfavorable terms for even the possibility of relief from their circumstances. You find yourself wondering what happens to all those accumulated wishes, whether they sit in some cosmic filing system waiting for processing, or if they simply dissolve into the groundwater like spiritual pollution, contaminating the entire region with the residue of human ambition gone wrong, which might explain why certain areas of England feel perpetually slightly haunted, even when nothing obviously supernatural is occurring. The phenomenon persists into modern times, though contemporary incidents tend to involve more mundane wishes with equally twisted outcomes. Lottery tickets that win exactly the amount requested but arrive the day after the claimant's death. Job promotions that fulfill career ambitions while destroying everything else in the person's life, or romantic relationships that provide precisely the companionship desired while revealing why that particular companion had previously been single for such mysteriously long periods. You realize that standing here beside this ancient well, you're not just observing a curiosity of English folklore. You're witnessing a place where the fundamental rules of cause and effect operate according to principles that seem designed by someone with a very dark sense of humor and an unlimited amount of time to craft elaborate practical jokes that span generations, making you grateful that your own wishes are usually limited to hoping your coffee stays warm and your commute remains bearable. You find yourself transported back through the mists of time to ancient Britain, where Celtic druids in their flowing robes performed elaborate water ceremonies that would make modern wellness retreats look like casual picnics, not realizing they were establishing traditions that would haunt the landscape for millennia to come. The Celts, those iron-working, poetry-loving warriors who gave us everything from intricate metalwork to the concept of seasonal depression, approached their sacred wells with a level of ritual complexity that would make contemporary wedding planners weep with envy, involving specific lunar timing, precisely measured offerings, and incantations that required years of training to perform correctly, which explains why modern visitors who skip straight to the coin-tossing phase tend to encounter results that range from mildly inconvenient to generationally catastrophic. You breathe in the smoke from ritual fires that burned continuously around the most sacred springs, tended by priestesses who understood that water wasn't just hydrogen and oxygen, but a conduit to otherworldly realms where the rules of physics yielded to the whims of beings who found human logic adorably quaint and human suffering mildly entertaining. The Celtic worldview recognized that certain locations served as thin places where the barrier between mortal reality and the supernatural realm grew permeable enough for communication, negotiation, and, occasionally, the kind of mistakes that required several generations to fully understand and potentially centuries to resolve, which is why their rituals included extensive protective elements that modern well-wishers tend to overlook in favor of the more streamlined drop coin, make-wish, walk-away approach that ancient priestesses would have considered roughly equivalent to performing neurosurgery with a butter knife. Historical records from Julius Caesar's campaigns describe Celtic priests spending up to 7 years learning the proper procedures for water divination, not because ancient education was particularly inefficient, but because the consequences of getting these rituals wrong tended to affect entire tribal territories for extended periods, leading to ongoing scholarly debate regarding whether Celtic training periods reflected genuine supernatural dangers or merely the practical necessity of maintaining priestly authority through artificial scarcity of knowledge. You watch as a Bronze Age ceremony unfolds around a natural spring that bubbles up from limestone caves, carved by underground rivers that have flowed since the last ice age, carrying with them mineral deposits that create an otherworldly blue-green color that seems to shift and swirl with patterns that don't quite follow the physics of normal water movement, suggesting that even 2,000 years ago, these springs operated according to principles that made contemporary druids distinctly nervous about the long-term implications of regular interaction with forces they could influence but never fully control. The ritual itself involves elements that would seem familiar to anyone who's attended a modern spiritual retreat, purification ceremonies, meditative chanting, and offerings of valuable objects. But the Celtic version included safeguards and protective measures that reflected generations of accumulated experience with supernatural negotiations gone wrong, suggesting that ancient priests learned through trial and error that certain beings were more than willing to grant requests, but attended to interpret instructions with the creative malice of a particularly vindictive lawyer specializing in contract disputes. Archaeological evidence from Celtic well sites reveals offerings that tell fascinating stories about ancient priorities and fears. Weapons thrown into sacred waters by warriors seeking victory. jewelry discarded by lovers hoping for reconciliation, and children's toys offered by parents desperate to protect their families from disease, drought, or the general unpredictability of life, in a world where medical science consisted primarily of herbs, prayers, and hoping for the best, which makes you wonder what modern archaeologists might conclude about our civilization based on the coins, car keys, and occasionally smartphones that accumulate in contemporary fountains. The Celtic festival of Lugnasad marked one of the most significant well-blessing ceremonies when entire communities would gather to perform rituals designed to ensure favorable harvests, successful marriages, and protection from the various supernatural beings who were thought to become particularly active during the transition between seasons, though these ceremonies also served as opportunities for ambitious individuals to make personal requests that often revealed more about human nature than ancient spirituality, such as the documented case of a Celtic chieftain who wished for his rivals to disappear from his lands, and spent the following year dealing with the unexpected consequences of getting exactly what he asked for in ways that technically fulfilled his request while creating entirely new categories of political problems. You notice how Celtic sacred sites were chosen based on natural features that modern geological surveys confirm possess unusual characteristics: underground streams that flow against gravitational logic, mineral compositions that create electromagnetic anomalies, and acoustic properties that amplify sound in ways that make whispered prayers audible from considerable distances, suggesting that ancient site selection criteria reflected a sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena that contemporary science is only beginning to appreciate. Though whether Celtic priests understood these locations scientifically or simply recognized their effectiveness through practical experience remains a matter of ongoing scholarly debate among historians who can't agree on whether to credit ancient peoples with advanced knowledge or merely acknowledge that some things work regardless of whether we understand why they work. The transition from Celtic paganism to Roman occupation created particularly complex situations around sacred wells, where Roman pragmatism encountered Celtic mysticism in ways that satisfied neither party, and often produced results that made everyone involved question their fundamental assumptions about reality, such as the documented incident at a spring near modern-day Bath, where Roman engineers attempted to redirect the water flow for practical purposes and discovered that certain ancient sites resist modification through methods that Roman engineering manuals had not adequately prepared them to handle, leading to a compromise solution that involved honoring Celtic protective rituals while pursuing Roman infrastructure goals, which worked about as well as you might expect any committee-designed approach to supernatural diplomacy to work. Celtic mythology describes the wells as gateways to the other world, ruled by beings who existed according to different temporal and ethical frameworks than mortal humans, which meant that negotiations required understanding not just what you wanted, but how your desires might be interpreted by entities whose concept of humor tended toward the elaborate, long-term, and occasionally multi-generational, explaining why Celtic wisdom traditions emphasized consulting with experienced practitioners before approaching sacred sites with specific requests, especially requests that seemed too good to be true or that involved other people in ways that might create unintended consequences for extended family members, tribal affiliations, or livestock, which apparently also fell under the protection of various well spirits with their own opinions about proper treatment of domestic animals. The Celtic concept of geas, magical compulsions or prohibitions, placed on individuals often originated from improper interactions with sacred wells, creating binding obligations that could persist across generations and manifest in ways that seemed unrelated to the original transgression. such as family lines that experienced recurring misfortune on specific dates, inherited allergies to particular substances, or compulsive behaviors that served no apparent purpose until someone traced the family history back to an ancestor who made an ill-advised wish at a sacred spring during a moment of emotional distress, which helps explain why Celtic societies developed such elaborate genealogical traditions, and why modern genetic counselors sometimes encounter family medical histories that seem to follow patterns that don't quite match conventional understanding of hereditary conditions. You find yourself appreciating the complexity of Celtic ritual protocols as you observe how every aspect of the ceremony serves multiple purposes: protecting the participants, honoring the spirits, maintaining community social structures, and providing entertainment value for gatherings that served as important social events in societies where Netflix hadn't yet been invented, and people had to create their own dramatic entertainment, often by volunteering to make wishes at sacred wells and then discovering whether they had correctly interpreted the subtle social signals indicating whether their particular requests were likely to be granted in ways they would actually want to experience, which added an element of community gambling to religious observances that modern insurance companies would probably find professionally fascinating and personally terrifying. You witness the moment when Roman efficiency collided with Celtic mysticism in ways that satisfied neither party's expectations and created entirely new categories of supernatural complications that would influence British folklore for the next 2 millennia. The Roman occupation of Britain, beginning in earnest under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, brought engineering expertise, administrative organization, and a distinctly practical approach to conquered territories that treated local religious practices with the kind of tolerant pragmatism typically reserved for quaint cultural curiosities that posed no immediate threat to imperial authority, which worked remarkably well until Roman citizens began experimenting with Celtic wishing wells and discovered that ancient supernatural entities didn't particularly care about citizenship status, tax obligations, or loyalty to distant emperors when it came to interpreting the fine print of mystical contracts. You observe Roman soldiers, merchants, and administrators approaching these sacred sites with the confidence of people accustomed to organizing vast territories through systematic application of law, engineering, and military force, not realizing that they were entering negotiations with beings who operated according to entirely different organizational principles, and who seemed to regard Roman efficiency as an amusing limitation rather than an impressive achievement, leading to interactions that left Roman record keepers struggling to document incidents that didn't fit neatly into their usual categories of natural phenomena, administrative challenges, or military encounters. Archaeological excavations at Roman-era well sites reveal thousands of coins, jewelry pieces, and curse tablets that provide fascinating insight into how imperial citizens adapted local customs to serve distinctly Roman purposes, such as military officers seeking promotion through supernatural means, tax collectors hoping for protection from increasingly creative forms of citizen resistance, and homesick soldiers wishing for transfers to warmer provinces. Though the results of these requests often reflected the fundamental cultural disconnect between Roman expectations of straightforward transactional relationships and Celtic understanding of spiritual negotiations as complex, ongoing commitments that extended far beyond simple exchange of offerings for favors. Roman curse tablets, or defictiones, represent some of the most detailed documentation of ancient supernatural practices, written in Latin, Greek, and occasionally local languages, on thin sheets of lead that were rolled up, pierced with nails, and thrown into sacred waters, along with specific offerings designed to ensure the attention of appropriate supernatural authorities. Though modern translations reveal that Roman cursors often demonstrated a level of creative vindictiveness that would make contemporary internet trolls seem positively restrained by comparison, requesting everything from romantic sabotage to business interference to digestive problems for their enemies, apparently under the impression that Celtic well spirits operated something like a supernatural customer service department that accepted complaints and processed revenge requests with professional efficiency. The Roman historian Tacitus documented several incidents where imperial administrators attempted to regulate local well worship through standard bureaucratic procedures, issuing permits for ritual gatherings, taxing offerings, and establishing official schedules for supernatural consultations, which worked about as well as you might expect any attempt to bureaucratize magic to work, resulting in situations where properly licensed prayers failed spectacularly, while unauthorized midnight rituals produced results that impressed everyone involved, leading to ongoing scholarly debate regarding whether ancient supernatural entities were expressing opinions about Roman administrative methods, or simply operating according to principles that didn't recognize imperial authority as particularly relevant to mystical negotiations. You watch as Roman engineers, those masters of practical problem-solving who gave us roads, aqueducts, and the kind of infrastructure projects that make modern construction workers weep with admiration, attempted to improve the efficiency of sacred wells through strategic modifications designed to enhance water flow, provide better access for worshippers, and create more impressive visual presentations that would reflect positively on imperial investment in local cultural preservation, only to discover that certain ancient sites resist improvement through methods that Roman engineering manuals had not adequately prepared them to handle, such as stone walls that refused to stay properly aligned, water channels that redirected themselves overnight, and decorative elements that developed cracks and patterns that seemed almost deliberately insulting to imperial aesthetics. The introduction of Roman coinage to Celtic well worship created particularly interesting complications, since traditional offerings had involved items of personal significance or crafted objects that represented substantial investment of time and skill, while Roman coins offered convenience and standardization that reduced the spiritual significance of the offering, while making it much easier for casual visitors to participate in rituals they didn't fully understand, leading to situations where ancient entities apparently developed opinions about monetary systems and expressed their preferences through increasingly creative interpretations of coin-based wishes, such as granting wealth in forms that technically fulfilled the request while creating tax obligations that exceeded the original value of the blessing. Roman military records describe soldiers making wishes for victory in battle, safe return from campaigns, and protection from the various diseases that made military service significantly more dangerous than enemy action. But the results often reflected the cultural disconnect between Roman military organization and Celtic understanding of warrior traditions, producing victories that came at unexpected costs, safe returns that delivered soldiers to situations they deserved to avoid, and protection from specific diseases that left them vulnerable to entirely different health challenges that hadn't been specifically excluded in their original prayers, which helps explain why experienced centurions often preferred traditional Roman military ceremonies to local spiritual practices that seemed designed by someone with a very different sense of humor about martial success. The cult of Sulis Minerva at Bath represents one of the most successful examples of Romano-Celtic religious syncretism, where Roman goddess worship combined with Celtic water spirit traditions to create a hybrid practice that satisfied both imperial administrative preferences and local spiritual expectations. Though even this carefully negotiated religious compromise produced documented incidents that suggested supernatural entities retain their original personalities regardless of official theological frameworks, such as the case of a Roman merchant who wished for business success and received a thriving trade in products that were technically legal but created social complications that made his commercial achievements somewhat Pyrrhic in nature, which demonstrates that ancient beings adapted to cultural changes while maintaining their essential characteristics, much like contemporary customer service departments that update their phone systems while retaining their fundamental commitment to making simple transactions unnecessarily complicated. The Roman practice of interpretatio Romana, which attempted to understand local deities through familiar Roman religious categories, worked reasonably well for most conquered territories, but encountered difficulties in Britain where Celtic spiritual entities seemed less interested in being categorized than in demonstrating why such categorization might be premature, leading to situations where Roman priests found themselves conducting ceremonies for deities whose behavior patterns didn't match their theological training, and whose responses to traditional Roman religious protocols often resembled the kind of creative compliance that makes managers everywhere question their communication skills and their career choices. You notice how Roman curse tablets reveal the extent to which imperial citizens adopted local supernatural practices, while maintaining distinctly Roman attitudes toward customer service, writing detailed complaints about poor performance by Celtic spirits, demanding refunds for wishes that didn't meet specifications, and occasionally threatening to report unsatisfactory mystical experiences to higher authorities, apparently under the impression that the other world operated according to familiar administrative hierarchies, where appeals could be filed and grievances could be resolved through proper channels, which suggests that even experienced imperial administrators sometimes misunderstood the fundamental nature of their supernatural trading partners. The archaeological record shows that Roman-era well offerings became increasingly elaborate and specific, reflecting growing understanding of the importance of precise communication with entities who interpreted requests with legal precision. Though this trend toward detailed specification often backfired when petitioners discovered that supernatural beings possessed legal training that exceeded Roman jurisprudence and found creative solutions to seemingly airtight prayer contracts that left the original wishers impressed by the technical accuracy of the results, while questioning whether they had actually gotten what they wanted or merely what they had inadvertently asked for, which provides early evidence that certain problems persist across cultures and time periods, regardless of technological advancement, administrative sophistication, or military conquest. You find yourself in the shadowed scriptorium of a medieval monastery, where learned brothers in rough wool habits carefully document incidents that challenge their theological understanding and occasionally their fundamental faith in divine order. Recording cases where Christian prayers offered at ancient wells produced results that seemed to bypass conventional religious channels and operate according to principles that made church doctrine feel like a general suggestion rather than divine law. Medieval monasteries, those centers of learning and spiritual discipline that preserved classical knowledge through the Dark Ages while copying manuscripts with a kind of meticulous attention to detail that would make modern quality control inspectors weep with appreciation, found themselves in the awkward position of ministering to populations who continued visiting pagan sites for practical purposes while maintaining Christian faith for eternal concerns, creating a theological balancing act that required more diplomatic skill than most monks had acquired during their religious training. You observe Brother Aldrich of Glastonbury, whose chronicle describes his attempt to purify a local well through proper Christian blessing ceremonies, complete with holy water, sacred relics, and prayers that had successfully consecrated dozens of other sites, only to discover that this particular location seemed to regard Christian sanctification as more of a mild seasoning than a fundamental transformation, continuing to grant wishes with the same creative malice it had demonstrated for centuries before Christianity arrived in Britain, though now it occasionally threw in biblical references that suggested supernatural entities had been paying attention to local theological developments and found them moderately entertaining rather than particularly authoritative. The medieval church's relationship with ancient well worship represented one of the more complex challenges facing religious authorities who were simultaneously trying to convert pagan populations, preserve useful local traditions, establish ecclesiastical authority, and avoid creating situations that might suggest Christian divine power was somehow incomplete or ineffective compared to older spiritual practices, which required the kind of subtle political maneuvering that would make modern diplomatic services seem straightforward by comparison, especially when dealing with wells that had been granting wishes for 1,000 years before Christ's birth, and showed no particular inclination to modify their operational procedures to accommodate new theological frameworks. Medieval hagiographies describe numerous saints who attempted to Christianize ancient wells through various methods, ranging from gentle blessing ceremonies to dramatic exorcism rituals, with results that often reflected more credit on the persistence of ancient spiritual entities than on the effectiveness of Christian interventions, such as St. Winifred's well in Wales, where the saint's own spiritual presence apparently negotiated some kind of cooperative arrangement with pre-existing supernatural forces that allowed Christian pilgrims to receive healing while ensuring that the well retained its original personality traits, including a tendency to interpret prayers with literal precision that occasionally produced miracles that were technically accurate but emotionally unsatisfying. Church records from the medieval period reveal the development of increasingly elaborate protocols for managing supernatural sites that couldn't be fully Christianized, including special blessing ceremonies designed to provide protective frameworks around pagan practices, designated feast days that honored local traditions while maintaining ecclesiastical oversight, and carefully worded prayers that acknowledged ancient spiritual presences while establishing clear hierarchical relationships that placed such entities firmly under divine authority, though the practical effectiveness of these administrative solutions varied considerably depending on whether the supernatural beings in question felt inclined to recognize papal jurisdiction over their ancestral territories. You witness the theological complications that arose when Christian prayers offered at ancient wells produced results that seemed to exceed normal divine intervention patterns, leading to scholarly debates about whether such incidents represented authentic miracles that demonstrated God's power working through all creation. Supernatural influences that operated independently of Christian divine authority, or demonic deception designed to confuse the faithful and undermine ecclesiastical authority, which created the kind of doctrinal puzzles that kept medieval theologians busy for centuries, and occasionally led to schisms, heresies, and the sort of religious controversies that made everyone involved question whether they had chosen the right profession. Medieval chroniclers describe incidents where monks making perfectly orthodox Christian prayers at ancient wells received answers that were theologically correct but delivered through methods that seemed more characteristic of pagan traditions than Christian miracles, such as the case of Brother Thomas of Melrose, who prayed for guidance in translating a particularly difficult theological text, and received inspiration through a series of dreams that provided accurate answers while being delivered by entities that bore a suspicious resemblance to Celtic druids, leading to extended theological reflection on whether divine wisdom could be transmitted through supernatural intermediaries who hadn't received proper ecclesiastical authorization, and whether such assistance should be gratefully accepted or carefully scrutinized for doctrinal purity. The medieval practice of offering prayers for the dead at ancient wells created particularly complex situations, since Christian theology provided specific guidance about intercession for deceased souls, while pagan traditions suggested that certain wells served as communication channels to otherworldly realms where the usual rules about life and death operated more as general guidelines than absolute boundaries, leading to incidents where grieving families received apparent contact with departed relatives through means that were spiritually comforting but theologically questionable, forcing local priests to develop pastoral responses that balanced compassionate ministry with doctrinal orthodoxy, which required the kind of diplomatic skill that most seminary training had not adequately prepared them to provide. Medieval pilgrimage routes often incorporated ancient well sites that had been successfully integrated into Christian practice, though the integration frequently involved compromise arrangements that allowed pre-existing supernatural entities to continue their traditional activities under new management structures that provided ecclesiastical oversight without fundamental operational changes, creating situations where Christian pilgrims received authentic spiritual benefits through processes that occasionally seemed to bypass normal religious channels and operate according to principles that made medieval theology feel like one possible interpretation of divine activity, rather than the exclusive framework for understanding spiritual reality. Monastic records describe attempts to standardize well worship through official church procedures, including approved prayer formulas, regulated offering practices, and designated feast days that channeled popular devotion into ecclesiastically acceptable formats. But the supernatural entities involved often demonstrated limited enthusiasm for administrative reorganization, continuing to respond to traditional approaches while treating official Christian procedures with the kind of polite compliance that suggested they were humoring ecclesiastical authorities rather than accepting fundamental changes to their operational methods, which created ongoing challenges for religious authorities who were trying to maintain both spiritual authenticity and institutional authority without alienating populations whose cooperation was essential for effective ministry. You observe how medieval manuscripts describe the development of hybrid religious practices that combined Christian prayer with traditional well worship elements, creating ceremonies that satisfied both ecclesiastical requirements and supernatural expectations, though such arrangements required careful navigation of theological boundaries and often produced results that were spiritually effective but doctrinally complex, such as healing miracles that occurred through prayer to Christian saints but manifested through symptoms that followed patterns more characteristic of pagan magical traditions, leading to ongoing scholarly debate regarding whether such incidents represented divine accommodation of human limitations or supernatural entities, adapting their methods to work within Christian frameworks, while maintaining their essential characteristics. The medieval understanding of miracles as divine intervention in natural order encountered complications at ancient wells where supernatural activity seemed to follow different rules entirely, operating more like natural phenomena with consciousness and personality than like occasional divine modifications of physical law, which required theological adjustments that acknowledged the reality of supernatural activity while maintaining Christian doctrinal frameworks about divine sovereignty and the proper relationship between natural and supernatural realms, leading to theological developments that influenced Christian understanding of miraculous activity for centuries afterward, and occasionally created conflicts between popular devotion and official church teaching that required careful pastoral management. You find yourself standing at the edge of Dartmoor's most infamous location, where ancient oak trees twist into shapes that seem to deliberately avoid resembling anything natural, while Spanish moss hangs like forgotten prayers in the perpetual twilight that filters through branches, arranged according to principles that make forestry experts distinctly uncomfortable about the local growing conditions. Wistman's Wood, that otherworldly grove that has inspired more folk tales, ghost stories, and rational scientific explanations than any single location reasonably deserves, contains within its gnarled boundaries a well so notorious that even medieval chroniclers refer to it obliquely, as if direct description might somehow activate whatever malevolent forces had been accumulating there since before recorded history began keeping track of supernatural incidents that defied easy categorization. The wood itself occupies a valley between granite tors that rise like ancient monuments to geological processes that occurred millions of years before humans arrived, to complicate the landscape with their wishes, prayers, and generally poor decision-making skills, creating a natural amphitheater where sound behaves according to acoustic principles that make whispered conversations audible from considerable distances, while somehow muffling screams in ways that local search and rescue teams find professionally disturbing and personally unnerving. You breathe the strange air that tastes of moss, decay, and something metallic that might be iron from the underlying granite, or might be something else entirely, while noticing how the temperature remains consistently cool regardless of season, creating microclimatic conditions that support vegetation normally found in much different environments and occasionally species that botanical surveys struggle to identify through conventional taxonomic methods, leading to ongoing scholarly debate regarding whether Wistman's wood represents a unique ecosystem preserve or something that makes standard biological classification systems seem inadequately comprehensive. The well itself sits in a clearing where the twisted oaks form a rough circle, as if they've been deliberately arranged to focus attention on the dark water that reflects nothing, not even the sky visible through the canopy overhead, creating an optical effect that photographers attempt to capture but somehow never quite manage to reproduce accurately, leading to hundreds of seemingly identical images that each seem to show something slightly different depending on viewing angle, lighting conditions, and the psychological state of the person examining the photograph, which suggests that the well's unusual properties extend beyond simple visual perception into areas that make professional photographers question their equipment, their skills, and occasionally their career choices. Historical records from the 13th century describe Wistman's Wood as a place where local shepherds refused to graze their flocks, not due to any specific documented incidents, but because of what they described as an atmosphere of wrongness that made both humans and animals feel like unwelcome intruders in a landscape that belonged to something else entirely, though modern ecological surveys confirm that the area supports thriving populations of various wildlife species that seem perfectly comfortable with whatever conditions make human visitors feel like they're being politely but firmly discouraged from extending their stays beyond necessary business. The well's reputation for granting twisted wishes appears in court records from medieval Devon, where several land disputes involved claims that property boundaries had been mysteriously altered following prayers offered at the site, such as the documented case of William de Ashburton, who wished for his neighbor's sheep to stop grazing on his land, and subsequently discovered that his wish had been granted through methods that technically resolved the boundary dispute while creating entirely new legal complications that required intervention from ecclesiastical courts, royal judges, and eventually a papal legate, who apparently decided that some property issues exceeded normal jurisdictional frameworks and should be resolved through prayer, negotiation with local supernatural entities, and carefully worded legal documents that avoided specifying exactly what kind of beings were being included in the settlement agreements. Medieval pilgrims occasionally ventured into Wistman's Wood seeking miraculous intervention for problems that conventional religious channels had failed to address, though church records suggest that ecclesiastical authorities strongly discouraged such visits while being unable to provide specific theological reasoning for their opposition beyond general concerns about the spiritual risks associated with seeking divine assistance through channels that hadn't received proper ecclesiastical oversight and approval, which created situations where desperate petitioners had to choose between official church disapproval and the possibility of supernatural assistance that might solve their immediate problems while creating long-term spiritual complications that were difficult to evaluate without extensive theological training. The Woods association with the Wild Hunt, that spectral cavalry that supposedly thunders across Dartmoor during winter storms, adds another layer of supernatural complexity to an already problematic location, since folklore suggests that the well serves as a gathering point for otherworldly beings who use the site for purposes that human visitors probably don't want to understand too clearly, creating situations where people arriving to make wishes occasionally encounter evidence of previous supernatural activity that makes their personal problems seem refreshingly mundane by comparison, such as scorch marks and patterns that don't follow normal fire propagation principles, animal tracks that lead to the well but don't lead away from it, and sounds in the middle of the night that suggest large gatherings of beings who apparently don't require sleep, food, or respect for human sleep schedules. You notice how the path to the well seems longer on some visits than others, despite GPS measurements that confirm consistent distances, creating navigation experiences that make orienteering experts question their compass skills and, occasionally, their fundamental understanding of how spatial relationships work in areas where supernatural activity might be influencing basic physical principles, leading to situations where experienced hikers find themselves arriving at their destination through routes they don't remember taking while carrying equipment that shows signs of wear patterns inconsistent with their recollection of the journey they've just completed. The oak trees surrounding the well demonstrate growth patterns that forestry specialists describe as architecturally impossible, given normal botanical constraints, with branches that interweave in ways that create natural archways, viewing alcoves, and acoustic chambers that enhance sound transmission while providing natural amphitheater seating for audiences that may or may not be entirely human, leading to speculation about whether the trees have been deliberately trained by human intervention, guided by supernatural influence, or simply evolved according to principles that make standard forestry management techniques seem inadequately sophisticated for dealing with vegetation that appears to possess opinions about landscape design and visitor management. Modern paranormal investigators equipped with electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and sound recording equipment consistently document anomalies at the well that exceed normal background levels while following patterns that suggest intelligent activity rather than random natural phenomena, though the data analysis often reveals more questions than answers, such as temperature fluctuations that occur in response to specific verbal requests, electromagnetic signatures that appear to form recognizable patterns, and acoustic recordings that contain sounds resembling conversations in languages that linguistic analysis cannot identify through standard academic methods, leading to research conclusions that satisfy neither scientific skeptics nor paranormal enthusiasts, while creating new categories of data that don't fit neatly into existing analytical frameworks. The well's water level remains constant regardless of rainfall patterns, drought conditions, or seasonal variations that affect other water sources throughout Dartmoor, suggesting either connection to deep underground aquifers with unusual hydraulic properties or supernatural maintenance systems that operate according to principles that make hydrological engineering seem like an incomplete science for dealing with water sources that apparently follow their own rules about supply, distribution, and availability for human interaction, which creates practical challenges for park services trying to provide accurate information to visitors who ask reasonable questions about natural phenomena that turn out to be neither entirely natural nor entirely explainable through conventional scientific methods. Contemporary wish-makers who venture into Wistman's Wood often report experiences that begin normally but develop complications that suggest they've entered negotiations with entities who operate according to different temporal frameworks than human consciousness, creating situations where simple requests become extended interactive processes that require ongoing communication, negotiation, and occasionally legal representation from practitioners who specialize in supernatural contract law, which is not a widely available professional service and typically requires seeking assistance from individuals whose credentials may be difficult to verify through normal professional licensing boards, leading to situations where people seeking simple magical assistance find themselves in need of complex legal advice about agreements they don't remember signing with parties they can't clearly identify for purposes they didn't fully understand at the time of initial contact. You find yourself in the windswept Yorkshire dales, where stone walls divide green fields that stretch toward hills that have witnessed more human tragedy than geography textbooks typically acknowledge. Standing beside one of several wells that earned their grim reputation during the 19th century, when grieving widows made prayers that revealed the dangerous difference between "bring back my husband" and "bring me to my husband," which turned out to be a distinction that supernatural entities found both amusing and technically exploitable, in ways that created more widows than the original industrial accidents, mining disasters, and generally hazardous working conditions that characterized Victorian Yorkshire's contribution to British economic development. The Industrial Revolution transformed Yorkshire into a landscape of mills, mines, and manufacturing that provided steady employment for working-class families, while creating working conditions that made life insurance companies nervous, and widows unfortunately common, leading to communities where supernatural alternatives to traditional grief counseling began to seem like practical options for women who had few legal rights, limited economic opportunities, and children to support in a society that treated widowhood as a temporary inconvenience that should be resolved through remarriage, religious acceptance, or quiet desperation, depending on personal resources and community support systems. You observe the social dynamics of 19th century Yorkshire communities, where widows faced economic pressures that made desperate decisions seem reasonable, especially when local folklore suggested that certain wells possess the power to reunite separated families through methods that weren't entirely clear but had worked for previous generations, at least according to stories that grew more optimistic with each retelling and often omitted important details about side effects, long-term consequences, and the specific terms and conditions that governed supernatural reunion services, which tended to include clauses that weren't immediately apparent to customers who were dealing with acute grief and weren't necessarily thinking with their usual level of analytical precision. The widow wells, as they came to be known throughout the region, included sites near industrial centers where the combination of ancient supernatural activity and contemporary desperation created conditions that made tragic folklore seem like viable lifestyle options, such as the well near Halifax, where textile workers' wives gathered monthly during winter evenings to offer prayers, personal belongings, and occasionally more substantial sacrifices for the return of husbands lost to machinery accidents, mining cave-ins, and occupational diseases that Victorian medical science was still learning to identify, though the treatments available were generally limited to hope, prayer, and the kind of folk remedies that sometimes worked but often made existing conditions worse, while creating new problems that required additional folk remedies in an escalating cycle of increasingly creative medical interventions. Historical records from Yorkshire parish churches describe priests struggling to provide pastoral care for congregations where widow populations significantly exceeded normal demographic patterns, not because Yorkshiremen were particularly prone to fatal accidents compared to other industrial regions, but because local supernatural remedies for widowhood seemed to create more problems than they solved, leading to situations where grieving women disappeared mysteriously, reappeared under circumstances that raised more questions than they answered, or demonstrated behavioral changes that suggested their reunion prayers had been answered in ways that made their families question whether the returned individuals were entirely the same people who had initially sought supernatural assistance, which created pastoral challenges that seminary training had not adequately prepared ministers to address through conventional theological methods. The well near Bradford became particularly notorious after a series of incidents in the 1840s where widows making reunion wishes began experiencing visitations from deceased spouses who demonstrated knowledge of personal details, family secrets, and intimate memories that proved their authenticity while exhibiting personality changes that suggested death, had not improved their characters, temperaments, or commitment to healthy relationship dynamics, leading to situations where families had to cope with supernatural domestic abuse, otherworldly financial irresponsibility, and the kind of marital problems that couldn't be resolved through normal legal channels because the legal system hadn't developed procedures for handling divorce cases where one party was technically deceased but still actively participating in household management through methods that exceeded standard family court jurisdiction. Medical records from Victorian Yorkshire describe symptoms among widow well users that physicians struggled to categorize through available diagnostic frameworks, including patients who aged rapidly after achieving reunion with deceased spouses, women who developed medical conditions that mirrored their late husband's fatal illnesses, and cases where successful supernatural marriages produced children whose birth certificates raised questions about paternity, maternity, and the basic biological principles that governed human reproduction in areas where ancient wells apparently operated according to genetic guidelines that made contemporary medical knowledge seem incomplete rather than authoritative, leading to the development of specialized medical practices that combined traditional healthcare with supernatural consultation services that most medical schools were reluctant to include in their official curricula. The social dynamics of widow well worship created community divisions between those who supported supernatural solutions to economic hardship and those who preferred conventional approaches to grief management, such as remarriage, family support, and gradual acceptance of loss, leading to theological debates that split local congregations, social conflicts that divided families, and economic tensions that arose when supernatural interventions produced results that affected property ownership, inheritance rights, and business partnerships in ways that existing legal frameworks were inadequately equipped to address, requiring the development of specialized legal practices that combined traditional jurisprudence with supernatural contract law, which turned out to be a more complex field of study than most legal professionals were prepared to undertake without extensive additional training in areas that law schools generally considered outside their normal academic scope. The practice of offering deceased husbands' personal belongings to widow wells created interesting archaeological deposits that modern excavations reveal to contain unusual preservation patterns, where organic materials that should have decomposed according to normal taphonomic processes instead remain intact in ways that suggest supernatural intervention in natural decay cycles, creating scientific puzzles that make archaeological dating techniques seem unreliable, and occasionally produce carbon-14 results that don't match historical documentation, leading to ongoing scholarly debate regarding whether certain historical artifacts require different analytical methods than standard archaeological science provides for understanding cultural practices that may have involved supernatural preservation techniques that exceeded normal environmental conditions. Contemporary folklore collections describe the widow wells as sites where the boundary between life and death became negotiable rather than absolute, creating opportunities for communication, visitation, and occasionally more permanent arrangements between the living and the deceased that operated according to principles that made Victorian spiritualism seem like amateur practice compared to Yorkshire supernatural traditions that had developed over centuries of practical experience with otherworldly relationship management, though the long-term success rates of such arrangements varied considerably depending on factors that included personal compatibility, supernatural contract terms, and the ability of all parties involved to adapt to relationship dynamics that exceeded normal human experience while remaining within the general guidelines that governed proper Victorian family behavior. The economic impact of widow well activity on local communities created complex social problems that required creative solutions, since successful supernatural reunions often produced households where deceased husbands resumed economic activities through methods that competed with living workers, created tax complications that confused revenue authorities, and occasionally resulted in business partnerships that raised questions about the legal status of deceased individuals who continued actively participating in commercial enterprises while maintaining their official status as departed members of the community, leading to administrative challenges that required cooperation between local government officials, church authorities, and supernatural entities who apparently had opinions about proper bureaucratic procedures for managing mixed living deceased communities. The practice of offering deceased husbands' personal belongings to widow wells created interesting archaeological deposits that modern excavations reveal to contain unusual preservation patterns, where organic materials that should have decomposed according to normal taphonomic processes instead remain intact in ways that suggest supernatural intervention in natural decay cycles, creating scientific puzzles that make archaeological dating techniques seem unreliable and occasionally produce carbon-14 results that don't match historical documentation, leading to ongoing scholarly debate regarding whether certain historical artifacts require different analytical methods than standard archaeological science provides for understanding cultural practices that may have involved supernatural preservation techniques that exceeded normal environmental conditions. Contemporary folklore collections describe the widow wells as sites where the boundary between life and death became negotiable rather than absolute, creating opportunities for communication, visitation, and occasionally more permanent arrangements between the living and the deceased that operated according to principles that made Victorian spiritualism seem like amateur practice compared to Yorkshire supernatural traditions that had developed over centuries of practical experience with otherworldly relationship management. Though the long-term success rates of such arrangements varied considerably depending on factors that included personal compatibility, supernatural contract terms, and the ability of all parties involved to adapt to relationship dynamics that exceeded normal human experience while remaining within the general guidelines that governed proper Victorian family behavior. The economic impact of widow well activity on local communities created complex social problems that required creative solutions, since successful supernatural reunions often produced households where deceased husbands resumed economic activities through methods that competed with living workers, created tax complications that confused revenue authorities, and occasionally resulted in business partnerships that raised questions about the legal status of deceased individuals who continued actively participating in commercial enterprises while maintaining their official status as departed members of the community, leading to administrative challenges that required cooperation between local government officials, church authorities, and supernatural entities who apparently had opinions about proper bureaucratic procedures for managing mixed living deceased communities. The tradition of widow wells gradually declined during the late 19th century as urbanization, improved medical care, and changing social attitudes toward women's economic independence reduced the desperate circumstances that made supernatural solutions seem like practical alternatives to conventional social support systems, though archaeological evidence suggests that some sites continued receiving offerings and prayers well into the 20th century, indicating that certain Yorkshire families maintained traditional supernatural practices alongside modern lifestyle adaptations, creating cultural transitions that preserved ancient knowledge while adapting to contemporary circumstances through methods that combined historical continuity with practical innovation in ways that satisfied both ancestral obligations and modern needs without completely abandoning either traditional or contemporary approaches to managing the ongoing challenges associated with mortality, loss, and the human tendency to seek solutions that exceed the limitations imposed by natural law, conventional social institutions, and the generally frustrating reality that death tends to be permanent regardless of how much you might prefer alternative arrangements. You find yourself in the suffocating atmosphere of 14th century England, where the Black Death moves across the landscape like a dark tide, transforming thriving communities into collections of empty houses, marked with red crosses that warn the living away from contaminated spaces, while desperate survivors gather around ancient wells to offer increasingly extravagant prayers to any supernatural entity willing to negotiate with humans who have run out of conventional options and discovered that traditional religious channels seem inadequately equipped to handle pandemic-level requests for divine intervention. The Great Mortality, as contemporary chroniclers called the plague that killed between one-third and one-half of Europe's population, created conditions where normal social structures collapsed faster than communities could develop alternative organizational methods, leaving survivors to cope with agricultural breakdown, economic chaos, and the kind of psychological trauma that made supernatural solutions seem not just reasonable, but practically inevitable for people who had watched their entire families die despite faithful prayer, proper medical treatment according to contemporary standards, and adherence to church guidance that seemed increasingly ineffective as the death toll mounted beyond anyone's ability to maintain accurate records or provide adequate spiritual comfort. Medieval medical knowledge based on humoral theory and the careful balance of bodily fluids that supposedly governed health and disease, provided explanations for plague symptoms that satisfied academic requirements, while offering treatments that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful, such as bloodletting for patients who were already weakened, purging procedures that accelerated dehydration, and various herbal remedies that occasionally helped, but more often created additional complications for people whose immune systems were already fighting battles that medieval pharmacology was unprepared to support, leading increasing numbers of plague survivors to supplement conventional medical care with supernatural alternatives that might work better than official medicine, or at least couldn't make existing conditions significantly worse. You witness communities where traditional authority structures have dissolved, leaving local populations to develop their own approaches to supernatural diplomacy without the guidance of educated priests who have either died, fled, or become so overwhelmed by pastoral demands that they have stopped providing the kind of detailed theological oversight that might prevent desperate parishioners from making the sort of bargains with ancient entities that seemed reasonable under immediate crisis conditions but created long-term obligations that exceeded the original scope of the emergency assistance being requested. The plague years saw a dramatic increase in offerings at ancient wells, as documented in contemporary chronicles that describe pilgrimage sites overwhelmed by visitors carrying silver coins, valuable jewelry, religious relics, and occasionally more creative forms of payment that reflected the medieval understanding that supernatural entities might accept alternative currencies for services that exceeded normal market rates, such as promises of future service, commitments involving family members, and agreements that extended beyond the immediate crisis period to include ongoing obligations that seemed acceptable when death appeared imminent but became increasingly burdensome as plague survivors discovered they were expected to honor contracts they had negotiated while under extreme duress and possibly not thinking with their usual level of long-term planning skills. Church records from plague-affected areas describe theological complications that arose when desperate prayers at ancient wells produced results that seemed to exceed normal divine intervention patterns, creating situations where entire families survived plague exposure through supernatural protection that operated according to principles that didn't match Orthodox Christian understanding of miraculous activity, leading to debates about whether such incidents represented authentic divine mercy working through ancient sacred sites or demonic deception designed to undermine ecclesiastical authority during periods when official church guidance seemed inadequately responsive to immediate survival needs, which created pastoral challenges that required balancing gratitude for effective supernatural assistance with concerns about theological orthodoxy and the long-term spiritual consequences of accepting help from sources that hadn't received proper ecclesiastical authorization. The social dynamics of plague survival created communities where normal moral frameworks required emergency modification, since traditional ethical guidelines hadn't anticipated situations where entire social structures collapsed simultaneously, leaving survivors to develop new approaches to property ownership, family obligations, and community responsibility that often involved supernatural consultation services that provided practical guidance for rebuilding civilization, according to principles that combined Christian morality with pre-Christian wisdom traditions that had maintained cultural continuity through previous disasters that exceeded the scope of recorded history, leading to hybrid cultural practices that satisfied immediate survival needs while preserving essential elements of both traditional Christianity and ancient spiritual knowledge that proved useful for managing problems that contemporary theological training hadn't adequately prepared church authorities to address through conventional pastoral methods. Medieval chroniclers document cases where plague survivors making wishes for protection discovered that supernatural entities interpreted protection through frameworks that included not just disease immunity, but comprehensive life preservation that extended beyond immediate health concerns to encompass financial security, social stability, and family continuity through methods that sometimes required relocating entire households to areas where plague conditions were more favorable, leading to population migrations that followed patterns suggested by supernatural advisors, whose knowledge of regional disease transmission apparently exceeded contemporary medical understanding, while creating demographic changes that influenced local economic development, agricultural practices, and community organization in ways that shaped regional culture for centuries afterward. Though such influence operated through mechanisms that remained largely invisible to official historical documentation. The practice of offering deceased family members' belongings to ancient wells became particularly common during plague years, as survivors sought supernatural assistance for proper burial rites, prayers for the dead, and occasionally communication with deceased relatives who might provide guidance for managing practical problems that the living were struggling to solve without access to traditional community support systems, though such communication often produced advice that reflected the deceased as pre-plague knowledge and might not be entirely applicable to post-plague social conditions, creating situations where supernatural guidance required careful interpretation and adaptation to circumstances that exceeded the experience base of even the most knowledgeable otherworldly advisors, leading to trial and error approaches to supernatural consultation that occasionally produced unexpected results requiring additional supernatural intervention to resolve complications that hadn't been anticipated in the original spiritual counseling sessions. The economic impact of plague year well worship created new forms of supernatural commerce, where traditional offerings of coins and jewelry expanded to include services, property rights, and future labor commitments that reflected the reality that surviving populations often had more time than money, more land than workers, and more need for supernatural assistance than conventional payment methods could accommodate, leading to complex barter arrangements between human communities and other worldly entities who apparently accepted alternative currencies while maintaining business practices that made medieval commercial law seem straightforward by comparison, such as contracts that included performance clauses, penalty revisions, and arbitration procedures that exceeded the sophistication of contemporary legal frameworks, while creating enforcement mechanisms that operated through supernatural methods that made traditional contract law seem like general guidelines rather than binding obligations. Archaeological evidence from plague year well sites reveals offering patterns that reflect the desperate creativity of people seeking supernatural assistance during historical emergencies, including medical equipment that hadn't worked, religious artifacts that hadn't provided adequate protection, and personal belongings from deceased family members who might serve as intermediaries for posthumous supernatural negotiations, though such offerings often created spiritual complications when otherworldly entities interpreted donated items as authorization for ongoing involvement in human affairs that extended beyond the immediate crisis period to include long-term participation in family decision-making, community governance, and regional economic development through methods that combined supernatural assistance with increasing levels of otherworldly oversight, that sometimes produced results that exceeded the original scope of emergency aid while creating new categories of community management challenges. The theological legacy of plague year supernatural practices influenced medieval Christianity for centuries afterward, as church authorities struggled to develop doctrinal frameworks that acknowledge the reality of effective supernatural assistance while maintaining orthodox theological principles about proper sources of divine aid, leading to carefully worded official statements that neither condemned nor endorsed ancient well worship, while establishing guidelines for evaluating supernatural phenomena that might represent authentic divine activity or potentially dangerous spiritual influences that required more careful theological analysis than desperate plague survivors were typically equipped to provide during emergency situations, when immediate survival took precedence over long-term theological considerations. Creating precedents for managing supernatural activity that influenced church policy regarding miraculous claims, popular devotion, and the complex relationship between official religious doctrine and practical spiritual practices that continued serving community needs, regardless of official ecclesiastical approval or disapproval. You descend into the haunted landscape of Cornwall, where ancient granite cliffs meet stormy seas that have witnessed centuries of mining disasters, smuggling operations, and supernatural transactions that made underground work even more dangerous than the cave-ins, flooding, and toxic gases that already characterized tin mining as one of Britain's most hazardous occupations, creating conditions where miners desperate for wealth, safety, or simply survival developed relationships with otherworldly entities who apparently understood our geology better than human prospectors, while maintaining business practices that made conventional mining contracts seem refreshingly straightforward by comparison. Cornwall's tin mining industry, which provided the metal that made Bronze Age civilization possible, and continued supplying European markets well into the modern era, created underground networks that extended deep enough to encounter geological formations that had been accumulating supernatural energy for millennia, leading to mining operations that occasionally struck veins of something more complex than metallic ore, such as pockets of otherworldly influence that transformed routine excavation into negotiations with entities who had been living underground considerably longer than humans had been digging holes, and who apparently regarded mining rights as temporary permits rather than permanent property transfers. The Cornish landscape itself seems designed for supernatural activity, with stone circles that predate written history, coastal caves that connect to underground river systems extending far beyond current geological mapping, and weather patterns that create atmospheric conditions favoring the kind of spiritual phenomena that make meteorologists question their instruments, while creating acoustic effects that amplify sound in ways that transform whispered prayers into community-wide announcements, leading to mining communities where private supernatural consultations became public knowledge faster than gossip networks could manage the social complications associated with everyone knowing exactly what their neighbors had been wishing for during moments of personal crisis. You observe miners gathering at ancient wells that bubble up from underground springs connected to the same aquifer systems that flood mine shafts during seasonal rains, creating water sources that taste of minerals, metals, and something indefinable that might be dissolved geological deposits or might be evidence that certain underground locations have been hosting otherworldly residents who use water as a medium for communication, negotiation, and occasionally practical jokes that demonstrate supernatural entities possess senses of humor that exceed human appreciation for timing, subtlety, and the general principle that workplace safety should take precedence over entertainment value when dealing with occupations that already provide adequate excitement through normal operational hazards. Cornish folklore describes the knockers, those underground spirits who supposedly warned miners of impending cave-ins, gas leaks, and other subterranean dangers through coded tapping sounds that experienced miners learned to interpret as geological guidance from entities who understood rock formation stability better than surface-dwelling engineers. Though the relationship between miners and knockers often involved payment arrangements that exceeded simple gratitude, including regular offerings of food, drink, and sometimes more substantial tributes that reflected the understanding that supernatural geological consulting services required compensation packages that might include ongoing profit-sharing arrangements extending beyond individual mining careers to encompass family obligations, community commitments, and regional economic participation that created binding agreements between human mining operations and otherworldly entities who apparently possessed legal systems more sophisticated than contemporary Cornish commercial law. Medieval records describe Cornish tin miners making wishes at sacred wells for protection from underground dangers, success in finding profitable ore deposits, and safe working conditions that would allow them to support their families while pursuing an occupation that combined back-breaking physical labor with constant risk of sudden death through methods that ranged from crushing to drowning to toxic gas exposure, though the supernatural assistance they received often came with terms and conditions that created new categories of occupational hazards, such as miners who discovered rich veins of tin but found themselves unable to leave the underground workings, or workers who achieved perfect safety records while their families experienced mysterious accidents that suggested supernatural protection might operate through redistribution systems that transferred danger rather than eliminating it entirely. The practice of offering the first ore from new mine workings to ancient wells created economic arrangements between human mining operations and otherworldly entities who apparently expected ongoing percentages of mining profits in exchange for geological guidance, workplace safety services, and protection from the various underground dangers that made tin mining one of the few occupations where supernatural assistance seemed like a practical business expense rather than superstitious waste of resources, though such arrangements occasionally produced accounting complications when supernatural business partners demonstrated opinions about mining techniques, labor relations, and profit distribution that exceeded their apparent expertise in geological consulting, leading to workplace disputes that required mediation between human mine owners and otherworldly entities whose negotiating positions weren't entirely clear, and whose enforcement methods exceeded normal industrial relations frameworks. Archaeological evidence from Cornish mining sites reveals offering patterns that reflect the specific concerns of underground workers, including mining tools that hadn't performed adequately, safety equipment that had failed during critical moments, and personal belongings from miners who had died in workplace accidents that might serve as intermediaries for posthumous supernatural consultation services, though such offerings often created spiritual complications when otherworldly entities interpreted donated mining equipment as authorization for direct participation in mining operations through methods that exceeded normal geological consulting to include active involvement in ore extraction, workplace management, and mining community governance that sometimes produced results exceeding the original scope of supernatural assistance while creating new categories of labor relations challenges that required specialized expertise in both mining engineering and otherworldly diplomacy. The Cornish tradition of mine blessings involved ceremonies that combined Christian prayer with pre-Christian protective rituals, creating religious services that acknowledged both divine authority and otherworldly geological expertise, while establishing spiritual frameworks for managing underground work that exceeded normal occupational safety guidelines. Though such ceremonies occasionally produced results that suggested supernatural entities had opinions about proper mining techniques that didn't always align with contemporary engineering knowledge or economic efficiency considerations, leading to workplace conflicts between traditional supernatural guidance and modern mining methods that required compromise solutions, satisfying both otherworldly advisors and human business requirements while maintaining operational safety standards that protected workers regardless of whether they were receiving supernatural assistance or relying entirely on conventional safety procedures and equipment. The relationship between Cornish miners and ancient wells often extended beyond immediate occupational concerns to encompass family economic security, community prosperity, and regional mining industry stability, through supernatural arrangements that apparently included economic development planning, resource management consultation, and long-term strategic guidance for maintaining mining operations that provided employment for entire communities while extracting mineral wealth in ways that satisfied both human economic needs and otherworldly territorial requirements, creating regional economic systems that combined conventional business practices with supernatural consultation services that influenced mining development, community planning, and cultural traditions for centuries, while operating through mechanisms that remained largely invisible to outside economic observers who analyzed Cornish mining success without recognizing the extent to which supernatural partnerships contributed to regional prosperity. Contemporary mining historians struggle to explain the remarkable longevity of Cornish tin mining operations compared to similar industries in other regions, noting that Cornish mines continued producing profitable ore deposits long after geological surveys suggested that easily accessible mineral reserves should have been exhausted, leading to speculation about superior mining techniques, exceptional geological conditions, or possibly supernatural geological consulting services that provided more accurate information about underground ore distribution than conventional geological science could access through standard surveying methods. Though such explanations remain largely theoretical, since detailed documentation of supernatural geological consulting practices tends to be excluded from official mining industry records, regardless of their apparent effectiveness in maintaining mining operations that exceeded normal geological expectations. The decline of Cornish tin mining during the 20th century coincided with changes in mining technology that reduced reliance on traditional underground techniques while introducing mechanized extraction methods that apparently didn't require the same level of supernatural consultation that had characterized centuries of manual mining operations, leading to speculation about whether otherworldly geological advisors found modern mining techniques less compatible with their operational methods, or simply chose to redirect their attention toward other forms of economic development that better suited their long-term territorial management objectives, creating regional economic transitions that combined industrial modernization with cultural changes that affected traditional relationships between human communities and otherworldly entities who had been participating in Cornish mining development since before written records began documenting the complex history of supernatural business partnerships that influenced regional economic development. Community social structures, and cultural traditions that preserved ancient knowledge while adapting to changing economic conditions that required creative approaches to maintaining both traditional wisdom and contemporary prosperity in ways that satisfied both ancestral obligations and modern needs. You find yourself in the gaslit study of a Victorian gentleman scientist, surrounded by the leather-bound journals, brass instruments, and detailed observational records that characterized the 19th century's ambitious attempt to apply systematic scientific methodology to supernatural phenomena that had previously been dismissed as peasant superstition, folklore, or religious enthusiasm. Though the results of such investigations often raised more questions than they answered, while creating new categories of unexplained observations that didn't fit neatly into the emerging scientific frameworks that were revolutionizing human understanding of natural law, physical principles, and the general relationship between empirical observation and theoretical explanation. The Victorian era's confidence in scientific progress created conditions where educated investigators approached ancient wells with the same methodical curiosity they applied to geology, chemistry, and physics, not realizing that supernatural phenomena might operate according to principles that exceeded contemporary scientific understanding while remaining perfectly consistent within their own operational frameworks, leading to research projects that documented remarkable phenomena through rigorous scientific observation, while failing to develop theoretical explanations that satisfied the academic standards of institutions where supernatural research wasn't considered entirely respectable, regardless of methodological sophistication or empirical accuracy. Professor Algernon Blackwood Smith of Cambridge, no relation to the famous author, despite persistent questions from colleagues who found the coincidence suspicious, whose 1847 monograph, Empirical Observations of Anomalous Phenomena at Sacred Wells, represents one of the most comprehensive attempts to apply scientific methodology to supernatural investigation, spent 3 years documenting electromagnetic anomalies, temperature variations, and acoustic phenomena at 17 different well sites throughout England, producing data that satisfied contemporary scientific standards, while reaching conclusions that made his academic colleagues question whether rigorous methodology could lead to results that exceeded acceptable theoretical boundaries, creating professional controversies that influenced scientific approaches to anomalous phenomena for decades afterward, while establishing precedents for managing research that produced empirically accurate results through investigation of subjects that weren't entirely acceptable to mainstream academic institutions. Victorian scientific instruments, with their brass fittings, precise calibrations, and mechanical elegance that made measurement itself seem like an art form, proved remarkably effective for documenting supernatural phenomena that apparently didn't object to being studied through conventional scientific methods, leading to extensive records of electromagnetic field variations that followed patterns suggesting intelligent response to human presence, temperature anomalies that occurred in response to specific verbal requests, and acoustic effects that amplified sound in ways that exceeded normal physical acoustics while creating communication opportunities between investigators and entities who seemed willing to participate in scientific observation. Provided such research was conducted with appropriate respect for territorial boundaries and operational protocols that weren't immediately obvious to human researchers, but became apparent through trial and error approaches that occasionally produced unexpected results requiring hasty experimental modifications. The Royal Society's relationship with supernatural research represented one of the more delicate diplomatic challenges facing Victorian scientific institutions, since member scientists were producing empirically sound documentation of phenomena that didn't fit established theoretical frameworks while maintaining professional reputations that required avoiding association with subjects that might be considered unscientific regardless of methodological rigor or empirical accuracy, leading to carefully worded research publications that presented observational data without drawing theoretical conclusions that might exceed acceptable academic boundaries, creating a literature of supernatural scientific observation that preserved empirical records while avoiding theoretical interpretation that might compromise professional standing within scientific communities that valued theoretical consistency as much as observational accuracy. Victorian ghost hunters, those intrepid investigators who combined scientific methodology with entrepreneurial enthusiasm, often included ancient wells in comprehensive supernatural surveys that attempted to catalog and classify British paranormal phenomena according to systematic organizational principles that would make such research more respectable, while providing practical guidance for individuals who might encounter supernatural activity during normal daily activities. Though such classification efforts often revealed that supernatural entities possessed organizational systems that didn't correspond to human taxonomic principles, and occasionally demonstrated preferences for avoiding systematic categorization through methods that made comprehensive supernatural surveys more challenging than botanical or geological research, requiring investigative approaches that balanced scientific methodology with diplomatic sensitivity to the territorial preferences of beings whose cooperation was essential for successful research while remaining entirely voluntary regardless of scientific objectives or professional research requirements. The development of photography during the mid-19th century created new opportunities for documenting supernatural phenomena, though early photographic attempts at well sites often produced results that satisfied neither scientific documentation standards nor artistic aesthetic preferences, creating images that captured something but weren't entirely clear what they had captured, leading to extensive technical discussions about photographic chemistry, exposure techniques, and equipment limitations that might explain unusual image characteristics while avoiding conclusions about whether supernatural phenomena possessed optical properties that exceeded contemporary photographic technology's capacity for accurate representation, creating professional photography challenges that required specialized expertise in both technical photography and supernatural investigation, which turned out to be a more complex combination of skills than most professional photographers were prepared to develop without extensive additional training in areas that weren't typically included in conventional photography education programs. Scientific measurement of water composition at ancient wells revealed mineral content that varied according to patterns that didn't correspond to normal geological processes, seasonal changes, or hydrological cycles that governed other water sources in similar geological settings, leading to chemical analysis that documented unusual elemental concentrations, while failing to identify specific causes for compositional variations that seemed to respond to human presence, seasonal festivals, and lunar phases in ways that suggested supernatural influence on basic chemistry. creating laboratory results that satisfied scientific analytical standards, while raising questions about whether certain locations might influence fundamental physical processes through mechanisms that exceeded contemporary scientific understanding of matter, energy, and the general relationship between consciousness and physical reality. Victorian medical professionals encountered increasing numbers of patients who claimed health improvements following visits to ancient wells, leading to clinical documentation that recorded genuine physiological changes while struggling to develop medical explanations for healing patterns that didn't correspond to known therapeutic mechanisms, disease progression models, or treatment protocols that contemporary medical science considered effective for specific health conditions. Creating medical case studies that preserved clinical observations while avoiding theoretical conclusions that might exceed acceptable medical practice standards, leading to specialized medical practices that combined conventional healthcare with supernatural consultation services that proved effective for patients while remaining professionally controversial within medical communities that valued theoretical consistency as much as clinical results. The Victorian fascination with seances, spirit communication, and otherworldly contact created conditions where ancient wells were increasingly incorporated into formal spiritualist practices that attempted to establish regular communication channels with supernatural entities through organized ceremonial procedures that combined traditional religious elements with contemporary spiritualist techniques. Though such ceremonies often produced communication experiences that exceeded organizers' expectations, while creating ongoing relationships between spiritualist groups and otherworldly entities who apparently possessed opinions about proper ceremonial procedures, group organization, and the general conduct of supernatural communication that sometimes conflicted with spiritualist theoretical frameworks, requiring compromise arrangements that satisfied both human spiritualist objectives and otherworldly operational preferences while maintaining ceremonial practices that achieved effective supernatural communication, regardless of theoretical understanding or organizational complexity. Archaeological investigation of ancient well sites during the Victorian era revealed artifact deposits that provided historical documentation of supernatural practices while raising questions about cultural continuity, religious development, and the extent to which ancient supernatural traditions had influenced British cultural evolution through mechanisms that weren't immediately apparent to conventional historical analysis, leading to archaeological theories that acknowledged cultural complexity while avoiding conclusions about supernatural influence that might exceed acceptable academic boundaries, creating historical scholarship that preserved empirical evidence while maintaining theoretical frameworks that satisfied contemporary academic standards regardless of whether such frameworks provided adequate explanations for all available archaeological evidence, leading to ongoing scholarly debate regarding whether certain historical phenomena required theoretical approaches that exceeded conventional academic limitations without compromising scholarly rigor or professional credibility with academic communities that remained divided about the appropriate relationship between empirical observation and theoretical interpretation when dealing with subjects that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, consciousness, and the general principles that governed natural law. You find yourself in the shadow of the Great War, where entire generations of young men disappeared into the trenches of France and Belgium, while their mothers gathered at ancient wells throughout England, clutching faded photographs and offering increasingly desperate prayers to any supernatural entity, willing to negotiate with women who had already lost everything that mattered, and discovered that conventional religious comfort felt inadequate for grief that exceeded normal human capacity for acceptance, creating conditions where ancient wells experienced unprecedented demand for services that challenged even otherworldly entities' ability to provide meaningful assistance for tragedies that exceeded individual suffering, to encompass a civilizational breakdown on a scale that made previous historical disasters seem manageable by comparison. The industrial scale of World War I casualties created communities where traditional mourning rituals couldn't accommodate the volume of loss, leaving surviving family members to develop alternative approaches to grief management that often included supernatural consultation services that had previously been considered emergency measures for individual crises but now seemed like essential community resources for populations trying to cope with death tolls that exceeded local burial capacity, memorial construction resources, and the psychological frameworks that normally helped communities process collective trauma through established cultural procedures that assumed most families would remain intact, and most young people would survive to continue community development rather than dying in foreign countries, under circumstances that prevented proper funeral rites, family closure, or the kind of gradual acceptance that traditional grief counseling was designed to facilitate. Victorian spiritualism had prepared some communities for systematic supernatural communication, but the Great War created demand for otherworldly services that exceeded anything spiritualist movement had anticipated, leading to situations where experienced mediums found themselves overwhelmed by clients seeking contact with deceased soldiers, while ancient wells began receiving offerings from families who had never previously considered supernatural alternatives to conventional religious comfort, creating hybrid spiritual practices that combined Christian prayer with pre-Christian supernatural consultation while developing new ceremonial procedures that acknowledged both traditional religious authority and otherworldly expertise in managing communication between living family members and deceased relatives whose deaths occurred under circumstances the traditional religious doctrine hadn't adequately prepared church authorities to address through conventional pastoral care methods. The practice of offering soldiers' personal belongings to ancient wells became a widespread ritual among military families, seeking supernatural assistance for locating missing soldiers, confirming battlefield deaths, or establishing communication with sons who had died far from home under circumstances that prevented proper military notification procedures, leading to well sites where accumulations of military uniforms, personal letters, and family photographs created impromptu memorial displays that served both as supernatural offering collections and community grief counseling centers where families could share their losses while participating in collective rituals that provided emotional support through shared spiritual practices that acknowledged both individual grief and collective trauma while maintaining community solidarity during historical circumstances that challenged everyone's capacity for normal social functioning. Military censorship policies that limited information about battlefield casualties created additional demand for supernatural intelligence services, as families sought otherworldly confirmation of military information that official channels couldn't or wouldn't provide, leading to situations where ancient wells apparently became alternative communication networks for obtaining military information through supernatural sources whose accuracy often exceeded official government reports while providing details about battlefield conditions, casualty circumstances, and final messages that military authorities either couldn't access or couldn't release through official channels, creating parallel information systems that operated through supernatural networks that proved remarkably reliable for families seeking accurate information about military situations that exceeded official disclosure policies while maintaining operational security requirements that protected military strategic planning from enemy intelligence gathering. The emotional intensity of wartime supernatural activity apparently influenced the well's operational characteristics, as documented in contemporary accounts that describe increased electromagnetic phenomena. more frequent temperature anomalies, and enhanced acoustic effects during periods when local communities were experiencing high casualty rates, suggesting that supernatural entities either responded to collective emotional distress or drew energy from concentrated grief in ways that amplified their ability to provide communication services, healing interventions, and practical assistance for surviving family members who needed supernatural support for managing problems that exceeded normal community resources, such as single mothers trying to support families without male income providers, elderly parents dealing with agricultural labor shortages, and communities attempting to maintain normal social functions while losing essential population demographics to military service and battlefield casualties. Contemporary letters and diaries reveal that many military families developed ongoing relationships with supernatural entities encountered through well worship, creating spiritual partnerships that provided emotional support, practical guidance, and occasionally more tangible assistance for managing wartime hardships such as food shortages, fuel rationing, and economic disruption that affected civilian populations whose men were serving overseas, though such relationships often required ongoing obligations that extended beyond immediate wartime circumstances to include post-war commitments, family obligations, and community service arrangements that created lasting connections between human families and otherworldly entities whose assistance during crisis periods established mutual obligations that influenced family decision-making, community participation, and cultural practices for generations afterward, leading to cultural changes that combined wartime adaptation with supernatural partnership arrangements that shaped post-war social development in ways that weren't immediately apparent to officials documenting social reconstruction efforts. The unprecedented scale of wartime supernatural activity created theological challenges for church authorities who were simultaneously trying to provide pastoral comfort for grieving families while maintaining doctrinal positions about proper spiritual practices that didn't necessarily accommodate the reality that ancient wells were providing effective spiritual services that exceeded conventional religious resources, leading to careful ecclesiastical policies that acknowledged community spiritual needs while establishing guidelines for evaluating supernatural phenomena that might represent authentic divine activity, or potentially problematic spiritual influences that required more theological analysis than desperate families were typically prepared to undertake during emergency circumstances when immediate spiritual comfort took precedence over long-term doctrinal considerations, creating precedents for managing popular religious practices that operated outside official church oversight while serving legitimate pastoral needs that conventional religious resources couldn't adequately address through standard ministerial procedures. Archaeological investigation of wartime well sites reveals offering patterns that reflect both traditional supernatural practices and wartime innovations, including military equipment that hadn't provided adequate protection, religious items that had failed to prevent casualties, and civilian goods that represented sacrifice of personal resources for supernatural assistance in protecting family members serving overseas. Though such offerings often created spiritual complications when otherworldly entities interpreted donated military equipment as authorization for direct participation in military operations through supernatural methods that exceeded normal battlefield logistics, while creating tactical advantages that influenced military outcomes in ways that couldn't be documented through official military records, but apparently contributed to battlefield results that exceeded statistical probability given available resources, troop strength, and strategic circumstances, leading to speculation about whether supernatural intervention influenced military history through mechanisms that remained invisible to conventional historical analysis, while producing results that affected individual survival rates, unit effectiveness, and campaign outcomes. The post-war period required communities to renegotiate supernatural relationships that had been established during wartime emergency conditions, creating situations where otherworldly entities who had provided extensive assistance during the crisis expected ongoing recognition, regular offerings, and continued involvement in community affairs through peacetime circumstances that didn't necessarily require the same level of supernatural intervention that had been essential during wartime, leading to cultural transitions that preserved beneficial spiritual relationships while adapting supernatural practices to peacetime social conditions that required different approaches to community organization, economic development, and cultural continuity, creating hybrid social systems that combined traditional community structures with supernatural consultation services that had become integral to local culture during the war and couldn't be easily eliminated without disrupting social stability that depended partly on spiritual partnerships that had been established during crisis conditions and had become essential elements of community functioning regardless of whether peacetime circumstances technically required supernatural assistance for managing normal social development, economic activity, and cultural preservation that communities had learned to accomplish through collaborative arrangements between human populations and otherworldly entities who had demonstrated their value during historical emergencies and expected continued partnership arrangements that acknowledged their contributions to community survival and prosperity through both wartime crisis management and peacetime social development. You find yourself in the ethereal atmosphere of 1920s Britain, where the devastating aftermath of the Great War created a generation desperate to reconnect with lost loved ones, leading to an unprecedented boom in spiritualist practices that transformed ancient wells from traditional wishing sites into elaborate ceremonial centers, where formal seances combined Victorian supernatural methodology with pre-Christian sacred traditions, creating hybrid spiritual practices that satisfied both contemporary grief counseling needs and ancestral supernatural protocols, while establishing communication networks between the living and the dead that operated through otherworldly entities who apparently appreciated the organizational efficiency of formal spiritualist procedures compared to the random individual requests that had characterized centuries of casual well worship. The interwar period's cultural fascination with supernatural communication created conditions where educated middle-class individuals who would never have considered consulting ancient wells during normal circumstances found themselves participating in elaborate spiritual ceremonies that combined scientific methodology with mystical practice, leading to spiritualist societies that met regularly at sacred sites to conduct organized seances using procedures that attempted to establish reliable communication protocols with deceased relatives, spiritual guides, and otherworldly entities whose cooperation was essential for successful supernatural communication, while remaining entirely voluntary regardless of ceremonial sophistication, technological enhancement, or group organizational efficiency. Professional mediums discovered that ancient wells provided enhanced spiritual reception compared to conventional seance locations, apparently due to geological and supernatural factors that amplified psychic abilities while creating communication conditions that facilitated contact with deceased individuals who might otherwise be difficult to reach through standard spiritualist procedures, leading to specialized spiritual practices that combined traditional mediumship with site-specific ceremonial techniques that took advantage of each location's unique supernatural characteristics, while respecting territorial boundaries and operational protocols that weren't immediately obvious to visiting spiritualists but became apparent through experience with otherworldly entities who possessed definite opinions about proper ceremonial procedures, group organization, and the general conduct of formal supernatural communication that sometimes required extensive negotiation between spiritualist organizers and resident supernatural authorities who controlled access to deceased individuals whose communication availability depended on factors that exceeded contemporary spiritualist theoretical understanding. The technological optimism of the 1920s influenced spiritualist equipment development, leading to seances that incorporated electromagnetic detection devices, acoustic amplification systems, and photographic equipment designed to document supernatural phenomena through scientific methods that would provide empirical evidence for spiritual communication, while satisfying skeptical observers who demanded objective verification of claimed paranormal experiences. Though such technological enhancement often produced results that satisfied neither scientific documentation standards nor spiritualist communication objectives, creating equipment that recorded something but left everyone uncertain about what they had actually documented, leading to extensive technical discussions about instrument calibration, measurement interpretation, and the general relationship between supernatural phenomena and contemporary scientific detection capabilities that apparently had room for improvement in areas that weren't immediately obvious to investigators who were combining cutting-edge technology with ancient spiritual practices that operated according to principles that might not be entirely compatible with electromagnetic measurement systems. Archaeological evidence from interwar well sites reveals a material culture of organized spiritualist practices, including elaborate ceremonial equipment that exceeded traditional offering patterns while reflecting the middle-class economic resources of spiritualist society members who could afford specialized spiritual communication devices, professionally produced Ouija boards, and custom ceremonial furniture that transformed ancient wells into formal spiritual communication centers equipped with amenities that made extended seances more comfortable for participants while demonstrating respect for otherworldly entities whose cooperation was essential for successful supernatural communication. Though such material enhancement occasionally created complications when resident supernatural authorities expressed preferences for simpler ceremonial approaches that didn't necessarily require extensive equipment, organizational complexity, or the kind of formal scheduling that made spiritualist society meetings more convenient for human participants while potentially conflicting with otherworldly operational preferences that weren't entirely clear to spiritualist organizers. The interwar period's economic prosperity allowed spiritualist societies to invest substantial resources in developing ancient well sites into permanent spiritual communication centers, complete with weather protection, seating arrangements, and ceremonial equipment storage that enabled regular group meetings, while preserving the natural characteristics that made these locations effective for supernatural communication, leading to site improvements that balanced human comfort requirements with respect for traditional spiritual practices that had been operating at these locations for centuries, before spiritualist societies discovered their enhanced communication potential, creating compromise solutions that satisfied both contemporary convenience expectations and ancestral ceremonial protocols while maintaining site integrity that supported ongoing supernatural activity regardless of organizational changes, technological enhancement, or increased human usage that might otherwise disrupt established spiritual relationships between otherworldly entities and specific geographical locations. Contemporary spiritualist literature reveals the development of increasingly sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding supernatural communication through ancient wells, including technical discussions about psychic energy concentration, spiritual frequency modulation, and the general principles that governed otherworldly communication systems that apparently operated according to scientific principles that exceeded contemporary understanding while remaining perfectly consistent within their own operational frameworks, leading to spiritualist research that attempted to develop comprehensive theories explaining supernatural phenomena through concepts that combined contemporary scientific knowledge with mystical understanding of consciousness, energy, and the fundamental relationship between matter and spirit that influenced both individual psychic abilities and group ceremonial effectiveness, while creating academic discussions that satisfied intellectual curiosity without necessarily improving practical communication results or enhancing ceremonial efficiency beyond what experienced mediums could achieve through traditional methods that relied more on intuitive skill than theoretical understanding. The social dynamics of interwar spiritualist societies created communities where shared grief provided the foundation for collaborative supernatural practices that served both individual therapeutic needs and collective spiritual development, leading to group ceremonies that combined individual communication objectives with community-building activities that strengthened social bonds while providing mutual support for participants who were processing wartime losses through spiritual practices that acknowledged both personal grief and collective trauma, while maintaining cultural continuity that preserved essential elements of traditional spiritual knowledge alongside contemporary therapeutic approaches that addressed psychological needs that conventional counseling methods weren't adequately equipped to handle during historical periods when entire communities were struggling with unprecedented levels of loss, displacement, and social disruption that required creative solutions combining traditional wisdom with contemporary innovation. The relationship between organized spiritualist societies and resident otherworldly entities often required complex negotiations that balanced human organizational preferences with supernatural territorial requirements, creating diplomatic arrangements that satisfied both parties while establishing operational protocols that enabled regular spiritual communication without disrupting the ancient spiritual ecosystems that had been developing at these sites for millennia before spiritualist societies arrived with their formal procedures, technological equipment, and membership requirements that might not be entirely compatible with otherworldly operational methods that had proven effective for centuries of individual spiritual consultation but required adaptation for serving organized groups whose needs exceeded traditional spiritual consultation patterns, while remaining within general guidelines that governed supernatural communication regardless of human organizational sophistication or ceremonial complexity. The influence of interwar spiritualist practices on popular culture created widespread acceptance of supernatural communication that extended beyond spiritualist society membership to influence general community attitudes toward ancient wells, spiritual consultation, and the general relationship between living and deceased family members, leading to cultural changes that made supernatural practices more socially acceptable while establishing community norms that acknowledged otherworldly entities as legitimate participants in local social networks, rather than marginal spiritual phenomena that required secrecy, shame, or defensive justification for people who sought supernatural assistance with problems that exceeded conventional social resources, creating cultural conditions that supported spiritual practices while maintaining social integration that preserved community cohesion regardless of individual supernatural beliefs, ceremonial participation, or communication experiences that might vary considerably between community members, while contributing to collective spiritual resources that enhanced overall community resilience during challenging historical circumstances. The documentation of interwar spiritualist activities provides valuable historical records of systematic supernatural communication that reveal both the possibilities and limitations of organized spiritual practice, including successful communication experiences that provided genuine comfort, practical guidance, and therapeutic benefits for participants while demonstrating the reality of supernatural phenomena that operated through mechanisms that exceeded contemporary scientific understanding. Though such documentation also reveals the challenges associated with maintaining reliable supernatural communication over extended periods, while managing group dynamics, territorial negotiations, and the ongoing obligations that often accompanied successful spiritual relationships with otherworldly entities, whose assistance during immediate crisis periods established mutual commitments that influenced long-term spiritual practice, community development, and cultural evolution in ways that shaped local traditions for generations afterward, while creating precedents for managing spiritual relationships that balanced individual needs with collective responsibilities through cooperative arrangements that satisfied both human community requirements and otherworldly operational preferences. You find yourself in the underground labyrinth beneath London during the Blitz, where ancient wells that had been forgotten by surface dwellers for centuries suddenly became essential sanctuaries for populations seeking shelter from bombing raids that turned everyday life into a desperate scramble for survival, creating conditions where supernatural entities who had been quietly managing underground water systems discovered themselves hosting thousands of frightened civilians who needed more than just physical protection from German aerial bombardment, leading to unprecedented cooperation between otherworldly residents and human refugees who were learning that London's underground spaces contained spiritual resources that exceeded anything the city planners had ever imagined when designing the tube system that accidentally connected modern transportation infrastructure with sacred sites that had been operating according to different principles for far longer than recorded history had been keeping track of municipal development projects. The London Underground Network, originally designed to move commuters efficiently through urban transportation challenges, proved remarkably effective as a bomb shelter system, partly because many stations had been constructed near or directly over ancient water sources that provided not just practical advantages like natural ventilation and drainage, but also spiritual benefits that civilian populations gradually discovered during extended shelter stays when conventional coping mechanisms proved inadequate for managing the psychological stress of nightly bombing raids that threatened to destroy everything familiar while offering no predictable timeline for when normal life might resume, creating community dynamics where desperate civilians began noticing that certain underground locations provided emotional comfort that exceeded what could be explained through simple physical safety, leading to informal spiritual practices that combined wartime practical necessity with ancient supernatural traditions that had never entirely disappeared from London's cultural memory. The Blitz created conditions where class distinctions that normally separated different social groups dissolved under shared survival pressures, leading to underground communities where wealthy businessmen, working-class families, and social outcasts who normally inhabited entirely different social circles found themselves sharing confined spaces where traditional social boundaries became irrelevant compared to collective survival needs, creating democratic conditions where supernatural knowledge that had been preserved primarily among working-class populations became available to middle and upper-class individuals who discovered that their formal education hadn't adequately prepared them for managing spiritual resources that could provide psychological support during historical circumstances that exceeded normal social experience, leading to rapid cultural exchange where traditional spiritual practices spread across class boundaries while adapting to serve urban populations whose spiritual needs exceeded conventional religious resources that seemed designed for peacetime circumstances rather than total war conditions that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilization, security, and the general relationship between individual survival and community cooperation. Government authorities initially attempted to regulate underground shelter activities through standard administrative procedures, establishing official schedules for shelter usage, assigning designated sleeping areas, and implementing sanitary facilities that would maintain public health standards during extended occupancy periods. But such bureaucratic approaches proved inadequate for managing community dynamics that developed around ancient wells, where supernatural activity apparently operated according to principles that didn't recognize government jurisdiction over spiritual matters, leading to situations where official shelter administrators found themselves negotiating with otherworldly entities whose cooperation was essential for maintaining community morale, resolving interpersonal conflicts, and providing the kind of psychological support that enabled civilian populations to survive months of nightly terror without complete psychological breakdown that might have compromised London's defensive capabilities through mass hysteria, social collapse, or civilian evacuation that would have represented strategic victory for German bombing campaigns designed to destroy British morale rather than merely British infrastructure. The presence of families with children in underground shelters created particular spiritual dynamics, since otherworldly entities apparently possessed strong opinions about child welfare that influenced their willingness to provide protection, comfort, and practical assistance for families trying to maintain normal childhood development under circumstances that exceeded any previous historical experience of urban warfare, leading to supernatural childcare assistance that included entertainment, education, and emotional support that helped maintain childhood psychological development, while demonstrating otherworldly entities' capacity for adapting their traditional spiritual services to serve contemporary social needs that hadn't existed when their original territorial agreements were established. Though such adaptation often required ongoing negotiation between otherworldly childcare providers and human parents whose child-rearing approaches might not be entirely compatible with supernatural educational methods that had proven effective for centuries of spiritual development, but required modification for serving children whose cultural background hadn't prepared them for direct spiritual instruction from non-human teachers. Archaeological evidence from wartime underground shelter sites reveals offering patterns that reflect both traditional supernatural practices and wartime innovations, including personal belongings sacrificed for family protection, military equipment donated for supernatural enhancement of defensive capabilities, and children's toys offered as payment for otherworldly childcare services that enabled parents to maintain employment, military service, or community responsibilities while ensuring their children received adequate care under circumstances where conventional childcare resources had been disrupted by bombing, evacuation, and general social chaos that accompanied total war conditions, though such arrangements often created lasting spiritual relationships between otherworldly entities and human families who discovered that supernatural child care providers maintained ongoing interest in child development that extended beyond immediate wartime circumstances to include long-term spiritual guidance, educational assistance, and protection services that influenced childhood development through methods that combined traditional spiritual wisdom with contemporary child development. Understanding that apparently exceeded formal educational psychology while remaining entirely compatible with normal childhood socialization, provided parents maintained appropriate levels of respect for supernatural educational authorities whose expertise had been developed through centuries of spiritual instruction experience. The spiritual intensity of wartime underground communities created conditions where supernatural activity reached levels that exceeded anything documented in previous historical periods, apparently due to the combination of desperate human need, concentrated emotional energy, and proximity to ancient spiritual sites that amplified otherworldly abilities, while providing enhanced communication opportunities between human populations and spiritual entities whose traditional territorial responsibilities expanded to encompass wartime community support services that exceeded their previous involvement in human affairs, leading to supernatural community organization that provided essential services including conflict resolution, resource distribution, emotional counseling, and collective decision-making assistance that enabled underground communities to function as effective social units despite overcrowding, resource limitations, and psychological stress that might otherwise have created social breakdown requiring government intervention that would have diverted military resources from defensive operations to civilian social management that could have compromised London's strategic defensive capabilities during critical periods when German bombing campaigns were attempting to achieve strategic victory through civilian morale destruction rather than military defeat. Contemporary diaries and letters reveal that many underground shelter residents developed personal relationships with supernatural entities who provided individual assistance with problems ranging from family separation anxiety to employment concerns to health issues that couldn't be adequately addressed through conventional wartime social services that were overwhelmed by civilian needs while operating with reduced resources and personnel who had been redirected to military service, creating individual spiritual counseling relationships that provided practical guidance, emotional support, and occasionally more tangible assistance for managing wartime hardships such as food procurement, housing arrangements, and family communication maintenance that required creative problem-solving approaches that exceeded official government assistance programs while operating through supernatural networks that apparently possessed resources, information access, and problem-solving capabilities that complemented rather than competed with official assistance programs, leading to hybrid support systems that combined government social services with supernatural consultation services that proved remarkably effective for maintaining civilian morale and community cohesion during extended periods of extreme stress that challenged everyone's capacity for normal psychological functioning. The post-war period required careful management of spiritual relationships that had been established during wartime emergency conditions, since otherworldly entities who had provided extensive community support during the crisis expected ongoing recognition and continued involvement in community affairs through peacetime circumstances that didn't necessarily require the same level of supernatural intervention that had been essential during bombing raids, leading to cultural negotiations that preserved beneficial spiritual relationships while adapting supernatural practices to peacetime social conditions that required different approaches to community organization, resource management, and cultural continuity, creating post-war London neighborhoods where supernatural consultation remained available for residents who had learned to value spiritual resources during wartime experiences, while maintaining normal urban lifestyle patterns that incorporated spiritual practices as routine community services rather than emergency measures, influencing London's post-war cultural development in ways that combined traditional British urban culture with spiritual practices that had been tested under the most extreme circumstances and proven their value for maintaining community resilience, individual psychological health, and collective social functioning during historical challenges that exceeded anything previous generations had experienced, while providing cultural innovations that enhanced London's capacity for managing future social challenges through collaborative arrangements between human communities and otherworldly entities who had demonstrated their commitment to community welfare through practical assistance that exceeded normal supernatural consultation services to encompass comprehensive community support systems. You find yourself standing at the threshold between ancient wisdom and contemporary uncertainty, where England's cursed wells continue operating according to principles that have remained remarkably consistent for millennia, while adapting to serve modern communities whose spiritual needs exceed conventional institutional resources, creating ongoing opportunities for supernatural consultation that provide practical solutions for contemporary problems while maintaining the essential characteristics of otherworldly guidance that has sustained British communities through Roman occupation, medieval plagues, industrial revolution upheavals, 2 world wars, and the various social transformations that have shaped modern British culture, demonstrating the enduring relevance of ancient spiritual practices that continue serving essential community functions, regardless of technological advancement, social change, or official institutional recognition of supernatural consultation services that operate alongside conventional resources while providing unique perspectives on human challenges that require wisdom exceeding normal educational, professional, or governmental expertise available through contemporary channels. Contemporary well visitors arrive with motivations that reflect modern life's particular stresses, such as career anxiety in an increasingly competitive global economy, relationship challenges in an era of social media-mediated communication, parenting concerns in a world where traditional community support systems have been disrupted by urbanization and geographic mobility, and existential uncertainty about environmental sustainability, political stability, and social cohesion that previous generations addressed through community institutions that provided greater social security while offering fewer individual opportunities, creating spiritual consultation needs that ancient wells continue addressing through otherworldly guidance that acknowledges both individual aspirations and collective responsibility for community welfare, environmental stewardship, and cultural continuity that requires balancing personal desires with broader social considerations that contemporary decision-making frameworks often struggle to integrate effectively. Modern technology has enhanced rather than replaced traditional well worship practices, with visitors using GPS navigation to locate ancient sites while carrying smartphones that document spiritual experiences through high-quality photography, video recording, and social media sharing that creates global communities of spiritual practitioners who maintain traditional ceremonial approaches while adapting communication methods to serve international audiences whose cultural backgrounds might not include direct experience with British supernatural traditions, but who discover universal spiritual principles that transcend cultural boundaries, leading to cross-cultural spiritual exchange that preserves ancient wisdom while adapting ceremonial practices to serve diverse populations whose spiritual needs reflect both universal human concerns and specific contemporary challenges that require creative solutions, combining traditional spiritual knowledge with modern practical applications that acknowledge global interconnection, technological complexity, and environmental responsibilities that exceed previous generations' experience while remaining manageable through cooperative approaches that combine human intelligence with otherworldly guidance. Scientific research continues documenting supernatural phenomena at ancient wells through increasingly sophisticated measurement techniques that provide empirical evidence for spiritual activity while avoiding theoretical conclusions that might exceed current academic acceptability, creating research documentation that preserves observational records while contributing to gradual scientific recognition of consciousness-related phenomena that operate through mechanisms not yet fully understood by contemporary theoretical frameworks, leading to interdisciplinary research collaborations that combine traditional scientific methodology with consciousness studies, environmental psychology, and anthropological investigation of cultural practices that demonstrate practical effectiveness regardless of theoretical explanation, suggesting that empirical validation might proceed independently of theoretical understanding while contributing to eventual development of comprehensive scientific frameworks that acknowledge consciousness as a fundamental aspect of physical reality, rather than merely an emergent property of complex neural processing that somehow manages to influence electromagnetic fields, thermodynamics, and acoustic phenomena through mechanisms that exceed current neuroscience understanding while remaining consistent with documented empirical observations. Environmental concerns about ancient well preservation have created conservation partnerships between traditional spiritual practitioners, environmental protection organizations, and government heritage agencies that recognize these sites as culturally significant landscapes, requiring protection from development pressures, pollution, and overuse that might disrupt spiritual ecosystems that have developed over millennia while serving essential community functions, leading to management approaches that balance public access with environmental protection while acknowledging otherworldly entities as legitimate stakeholders in conservation decisions that affect their territorial authority and spiritual service capabilities, creating precedents for environmental management that includes supernatural consultation in land use planning, development permitting, and conservation strategy development that acknowledges spiritual values alongside ecological, historical, and recreational considerations that influence contemporary land management policies through processes that combine conventional environmental science with traditional ecological knowledge preserved through spiritual consultation traditions. Economic development pressures create ongoing challenges for ancient well preservation, as urbanization, infrastructure development, and commercial tourism threaten sites that provide essential spiritual services while generating economic value that might justify preservation through market mechanisms, rather than purely cultural or environmental arguments, leading to creative financing approaches that recognize spiritual consultation as a valuable community resource deserving economic support through mechanisms that might include cultural tourism development, spiritual service taxation that provides revenue for site maintenance, or government recognition of supernatural consultation as legitimate healthcare alternative that deserves public funding comparable to other complementary therapy programs that provide documented health benefits for community populations whose spiritual needs exceed conventional medical or psychological services while operating cost-effectively compared to traditional mental health interventions that often require extensive professional resources, extended treatment periods, and ongoing pharmaceutical management. That spiritual consultation approaches often address more efficiently through otherworldly guidance that provides immediate practical solutions for problems that conventional therapy might require months or years to resolve through approaches that address symptoms rather than underlying spiritual causes. Climate change implications for ancient wells include both challenges and opportunities, as environmental changes might affect underground water systems that support spiritual activity while creating increased demand for supernatural consultation regarding environmental adaptation, sustainable development, and community resilience strategies that require wisdom, exceeding normal environmental planning expertise, leading to collaborative approaches that combine scientific climate research with otherworldly environmental guidance that provides long-term perspective on climate adaptation, based on centuries of experience managing environmental change while maintaining community stability through methods that integrate human adaptation strategies with natural system preservation. Creating sustainable development models that acknowledge both human needs and environmental limits while preserving spiritual practices that contribute to community resilience through guidance that helps communities adapt to changing conditions while maintaining cultural identity, social cohesion, and environmental stewardship practices that support long-term sustainability goals, requiring cooperation between human communities and otherworldly entities whose environmental knowledge exceeds contemporary scientific understanding, while remaining practical for implementation through community-based approaches that combine traditional wisdom with modern environmental management techniques. Future technological developments might enhance supernatural consultation through digital communication platforms that facilitate remote spiritual consultation. Virtual reality systems that provide immersive spiritual experiences for people unable to visit physical well sites, and artificial intelligence applications that help interpret otherworldly guidance for contemporary, practical applications. Though such technological mediation requires careful development that preserves essential characteristics of spiritual communication while adapting traditional practices to serve global populations whose spiritual needs exceed local community resources. Creating opportunities for international spiritual consultation networks that maintain cultural authenticity while providing accessible spiritual guidance for diverse populations whose contemporary challenges require both universal spiritual wisdom and specific cultural adaptation that respects traditional ceremonial protocols while accommodating modern lifestyle limitations. Technological capabilities